So thank you all for joining us today at our centennial celebration for the historic Smathers Library building. I'm Patrick Reeks, Interim Dean of University Libraries, and I'd like to extend warm greetings on behalf of our entire library administration, staff, and faculty. We're honored to have you with us today for this special celebration and would particularly like to welcome the members of our Library Leadership Board and the Smathers family who are with us today. It's also my privilege to welcome and introduce our Centennial Keynote speaker, Senator Bill Nelson. I like that. I like having Alex in a room when I'm talking because he'll... It's also my... As a Florida native from Miami, he's devoted his life to public service. He attended the University of Florida before continuing his education at Yale University and received his law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law. I'd also like to point out that Bill and I are both graduates of Melbourne High School. Go Bulldogs. After serving as Florida's treasurer, insurance commissioner, and fire marshal in the 1990s, he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2000 and served until 2019. Nominated by President Joe Biden, he also served as the administrator of NASA from 2021 to 2025. Smathers Libraries is home to the Bill Nelson Collection, which documents over 46 years of public service by one of Florida's most influential political figures. In addition to his time in the Senate, the collection also documents his training and flight on the Space Shuttle Columbia mission in 1986. Senator Nelson is a great friend of our university and the George A. Smathers Libraries, and we're honored to welcome him today. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Bill Nelson.
Well, this is a treat for me. In many more ways than one. And I want to tell you about some of those because there's a lot of nostalgia here in this room. First of all, in the course of this, I'm going to tell you part of why I'm here is because of this gentleman here. And this is Bruce Smathers. This goes way back because I ended up being an intern in Senator George Smathers' office, and that was for 2 summers. And the second summer, I met Senator Smathers' youngest son, and it so happened that I was transferring from the University of Florida to Yale. Bruce and I ended up working it out to be roommates. Now, this has been a friendship since the class of, well, when we started, about 1962, when I first met Bruce. That's a lot of years. But it's even more complicated than that, because after law school and after the military, I'm back in my hometown of Melbourne, starting my law practice. And I bring a group of high schoolers in the high school key club. I had joined the Kiwanis Club and went back out to the high school as their sponsor. And so I'm hauling all of these key clubbers to their state convention in Jacksonville, where Bruce is there practicing law. And so I called him up and I said, look, we're going to have this banquet. I'm supposed to speak. And I have a date flying in. Why don't you get a date? And then after the banquet, we'll all go out on the town. Bruce brings Grace Cavert. I finished that weekend with all of the students. I go back home, and Bruce is on the phone with me saying, the two of you, Grace and you, are perfectly matched. And he keeps after me for another 2 months until I come back to Jacksonville and take out Grace. Grace and I have now been married almost 54 years. But the story is even better, because years later, Susan Gamble is a lawyer on my congressional staff in the Orlando office. And she's absolutely miserable because she hasn't found who she's looking for. And I said, Susan, your problem is that you're seeing a bunch of little boys. You need to see some men. I'm going to set you up with 3 blind dates. And so, sure enough, 3 blind dates, good friends, all. And so I call Susan, and she happens to be on a date with one of these 3. And I said, Susan, have you seen all 3? Have you made up your mind? And of course, she can't talk because she's in. I said, okay, I'm going to name them by number. 1, 2, and 3, and you tell me the number. And so she repeated the number that was identified with Bruce. And so I had set them up on a blind date prior to that time. And now I have the privilege of being the godfather to Bruce Smathers Jr. and his intended Courtney. And in 3 weeks, I'm going to perform the wedding for these 2. Now, there's one other connection I want to make here, and you all are unsuspecting of this. This is an example of how friendships last over the years. And that's a long time since we first got together in 1962. When I went to Congress in 78, there was a fella that I got to know that suggested, why don't you do something different in Congress? Why don't you put together a group of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, all members of Congress, and why don't you meet together once a week, usually around lunch, where you all could share each other's lives together, where you could read some scripture, and you could have a friendship in an unusual kind of way. And then you could pray for each other. We did that. When I went to Congress in 79, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and one of the Democrats no longer with us, Congressman Don Bunker from the state of Washington, but his widow is here today and his 2 children, and that's Carolyn Bunker. Would you stand up, Carolyn? And her son, Jonathan, and her daughter, Dawn Elise. So you can see, just if for that reason, it is a great privilege for me to be here today. And what a privilege to be here under the tutelage and watchful eye of Dean Judy Russell. So because Judy convinced me, among several state universities that I should send my papers here. And of course, she could not have been more kind. And we started this little thing called the Nelson Initiative for Ethics and Leadership. And in the course of the years, as I've been in and out of government, first in the Senate, then later at NASA, we have brought a variety of people here to the university where basically I sit down and engage in a conversation with them in front of students and faculty and others that are welcome from the community. The first one I did was with my colleague from the Senate, Marco Rubio. And that was of interest because increasingly the fractiousness, the division that is going on, people suddenly saw two senators of opposite parties that actually got along together. Then I brought a historian, John Meacham, here. I did all of this not only with Judy, but with John Mills, the emeritus of the law school. And we cooked this up. And then I started bringing astronauts here. We're going to do that again in January. On January the 12th, the exact day, 40 years, the anniversary of when we launched from the Kennedy Space Center in a 6-day mission that was almost flawless after 4 scrubs, of which it would have not been a good day had we launched on any one of those scrubs. But the 5th try, it was almost flawless, only to return to Earth on January the 18th. And 10 days later, Challenger launches and blows up. And so the extraordinary tales and what these astronauts represent of leaders and of the ethics that they have displayed, that's all going to be told as we gather in a reunion on January the 12th here at the university. The ethics of which it has come back to bite NASA 3 times now. First, the Apollo 1 fire that killed Grissom, White, and Chaffee. A countdown, a simulated countdown on the pad, and the mistakes that were made there that should have never been made because the management was not listening to the astronauts, and they were not listening to the engineers on the line. The second one, Challenger, the loss of 7 astronauts. Same thing for a different technical reason. This time on ascent, 73 seconds into flight. And then the third time, the loss of Columbia, the very orbiter that I'd flown on, in 2003. For a different technical reason upon descent through the fiery heat of re-entry. But again, the same lack of leadership and ethics has killed 17 astronauts. We're going to retell that story in January as we bring the crew here. But we're here for the library today, and of course, the library being this extraordinary place, 100 years old, the first freestanding building on the UF campus, the original grand reading room of the university upstairs, and this building named after Senator Smathers, but the entire library system carrying his name. And so my connection with this family you have heard goes back, but it's intertwined so much more. And I want you to hear some of these stories. So, World War II was a defining time of the building of leaders, not only of remaking the history of the world. And out of that time, in an immediate aftermath, the next year, as a matter of fact, after the surrender by Japan, then came the election of 46. A young prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney, who had come home after the war because already he had been promoted to bird colonel. He had actually been in an airplane crash and had fortunately not been severely injured. And this was a time a lot of those successful veterans from the war started running for Congress. And so too, George A. Smathers of Miami, a graduate of Miami High School, ran against a 4-term incumbent. And that's hard to unseat an incumbent congressman, particularly in those days when there was virtually only one party. It was a one-party state. It was a Democratic Party, as so much of the South was a holdover as from the Civil War era as a one-party state. Senator Smathers won that and comes to Congress in the class of 46 with John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts and Richard Nixon of California. And the story then evolves. All three of them were friends. And because they were both Democrats, Smathers and Kennedy particularly became friends. And come 1950, Smathers is elected to the Senate. 1952, Kennedy defeats an incumbent, Henry Cabot Lodge. And I think it was also 1950 that Nixon is elected senator. And then come 1952, when Eisenhower is elected, he has selected the young senator from California as his vice president. Now, this is the stage upon which politics is coming together, but relationships are really important. Let's go back to the 50 Democratic primary. I actually attended the debate between Congressman George Smathers and Senator Claude Pepper. Of course, I was very young. My father took me. It was in Bayfront Park in the band shell, which was outdoor, right by Biscayne Bay. I just remember the visual. I don't remember I remember the voices, but of course I couldn't comprehend and remember. But here's what led to that and the subsequent election results. Claude Pepper, a person that I came to love, by the way, because in '78, having been elected a brand new congressman, Claude Pepper is a senior member of the House of Representatives. He had been for years the chairman, since the Democrats had the majority, of the Aging Committee. And in that, he had gained a tremendous reputation as standing up for senior citizens. And then with his seniority, he became the chairman of the Rules Committee. And of course, as a young congressman, as a part of the Florida delegation, naturally, we all got together. We all loved each other. We all worked together, Democrats and Republicans. One of our favorites was Republican Congressman Bill Young of St. Petersburg. It's not like it is today. It was far different. The speaker was Tip O'Neill when I went. The Republican leader was Bob Michel. The two of them would have their fights, but they were personal friends. At the end of the day, when it was time to cut the deal, they could do the deal. So Reagan comes in, and of course Tip is an anathema to Reagan. And the two of them are at it. But they're two old Irishmen who knew how to get along. And this you don't know. When Reagan was shot outside of the Washington Hilton, and he ended up being in serious condition, who is over there in his room, kneeling at his bedside, praying for his recovery? Tip O'Neill. That's what you miss, particularly what we miss today. The politics has become such a blood sport, and it's so partisan, excessively partisan. It wasn't like that even as recent as when I entered in '78, and again when I came into the Senate in 2000. And we've seen it change to this point. So in this election, Pepper had been elected for 3 terms. He was the United States Senator. But in the course of the war and in its immediate aftermath, while Smathers and Kennedy are young congressmen, Nixon as well, Claude Pepper is continuing his line of showing great praise for Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Politically, he was committing hara-kiri. And he continued on that. And so he even wanted to share, this was his public position, he wanted to share nuclear technology with the Soviets. And that was just not going to go over in the politics of Florida in 1950, nor the politics of the country in the early 50s. Because you remember Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, was going around and said, I have a list of all the communists in the government of the United States. And he had waved this list, but then he would never produce it. And there were a lot of people that were run out of office because they were branded communist. Now I'm going to tell you something else you probably don't know. That was called the Red Scare. But there was also what historians are now calling the Lavender Scare, because there was an attempted purge of the gay community at the same time. It did not have the visibility of the Red Scare, but it was clearly there. And that was the politics that was invading our American political establishment at the time. So is it any wonder the Soviets had started to scare us, and domestically, communists were being rooted out of the system by Senator Joseph McCarthy, that the politics in Florida was such, with Senator Pepper having had the record and visibility that he had, then Congressman Smathers surely saw that as a vulnerability. And then Congressman Smathers won handily in the election. And in that year, it was the first defeat of an incumbent senator, and 2 years later, it's repeated in Massachusetts by Congressman Kennedy defeating Henry Cabot Lodge. And so you see now what the stage is being set. In the 1950 race, some journalists one day covering the race, when they were bored, started fancying the building of a story that in the panhandle of Florida, that campaigning was being done to take care of ignorance of everyday life. Now, I say this because that's my heritage too. I'm a fifth-generation Floridian whose great-great-grandfather came from Denmark, landed in Port St. Joe in 1829, just 8 years after we became a territory, having acquired it from Spain. And that part of my family have been dirt farmers. As a matter of fact, I was told growing up that I even have cousins that are completely illiterate, which actually was true. But because of that being a brand of rural parts of Northwest Florida, the board press corps started making up stories about how you could take advantage of that illiteracy in the campaign, to which they said that George Smathers in the campaign would make a redneck speech. And the speech, they said, was that Claude Pepper, quote, practiced nepotism with his sister-in-law. End of quote. That Senator Pepper, would you believe that his sister was a thespian in New York City? And, oh, it was awful because he practiced, before marriage, he practiced celibacy. So that took roots, it took life, it has been a myth, and Senator Smathers, knowing that it was not true, that he had not said those things, he offered publicly a $10,000 reward for anybody that could prove that he had said those things. And of course, there were no takers. But that was the tumult of that campaign. So now Senator Smathers is a part of the Senate. John F. Kennedy joins 2 years later. And in the meantime, he has been noticed by the senator from Texas, Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson then, shortly thereafter, becomes the majority leader. And he starts relying on George Smathers. In the late 50s, Lyndon Johnson has a heart attack, and so he is immobilized in the hospital in a recuperation period for some period of time, and he names George Smathers as the acting majority leader. Later on, LBJ tries to get George Smathers to take over the number 2 Democratic position in the Senate, that of whip, and Senator Smathers says, I just can't do that. I would be too much out of step with my constituency. And yet, in the first civil rights bill in the late 50s, who does LBJ rely on to whip the votes? Since the Democrats from the South were solidly against it, it's George Smathers that's helping LBJ put together the votes. So he then, if I can fast forward, now Johnson is vice president. And after the assassination of Kennedy, he takes over as president. And he realizes, Lyndon Johnson, realizes that what Kennedy had pushed for so hard and was planning to do as president, that President Johnson is now in a position to do. And that is the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Smathers is conflicted because of the constituency. But in 65, when the 65 Voting Rights Bill comes up, he does not vote for it in the Senate, but when it comes back from conference committee, Smathers votes for the 65 Civil Rights Bill. Go back a few years. So Kennedy is getting ready to go to Dallas. It's 1963. His trip just before Dallas is to Florida. It's to the Kennedy Space Center, which then was not the Kennedy Space Center. It was called Cape Canaveral. Only after Kennedy's death was it renamed from Cape Canaveral to Cape Kennedy, and subsequently, a few years later, the historical geographical name of Canaveral is restored, and instead the name Kennedy is applied to the new NASA center, the Kennedy Space Center. But at this point, in November of 1963, Kennedy goes to the Space Center, and from his Florida trip, and he's accompanied by George Smathers. And when Kennedy leaves Florida, he and Jackie go to Dallas. And some of you are old enough to remember that experience. And that experience, there are two experiences that Bruce and I had with regard to President Kennedy that are forever etched in our mind's eye. The first is October of 1962, when Russian military boats are steaming to Cuba with intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I will never forget watching a grainy black and white TV of Kennedy's address to the nation making it very clear that if they do not vacate those nuclear-tipped missiles from Cuba, that will be met with full-scale resistance. And of course, that's considered one of the greatest and successful negotiations of all time. A lot of that led by Robert Kennedy in eventually getting Nikita Khrushchev to understand that he had to back down. At that point, Bruce and I were just trying to figure out, if there is a nuclear attack, obviously New York City is one of the targets. How in the world are we going to get home from New Haven, Connecticut, and get around New York City to be able to get back to Florida? And we didn't know. But that was the tension at the time. And of course, the next experience that Bruce and I had with, oh, and by the way, guess who was in the room with President Kennedy when he made that famous speech on TV to the nation about the Cuban Missile Crisis? There was only one member of Congress in the room, and that's him, Senator Smathers. Okay, now, a year later, Bruce and I, it's a weekend, and Kennedy has been slain. It's a Friday. I'm in an international politics class, and the professor doesn't show up. And Yale had a rule that you would wait at least 15 minutes for a professor. And if he didn't show, then you could leave. But there are these rumors that are suddenly circulated. And in came this very wizened professor. And he tells that the president has been shot. They don't know his condition. And the professor gives a lecture on the history of political assassinations. And then we leave the class, go outside. Everybody's clumped around the open window of a car door with the radio turned on. And we learn the president is dead. Neither one of us remember, but Bruce and I ended up in Washington, D.C. in the next couple of days. His father, Senator Smathers, takes the two of us down to the White House, and we are standing in the north entrance inside the White House as Mrs. Kennedy is forming up the procession to walk to the church for the funeral. She's flanked on the right by Bobby. She's flanked on the left by Teddy. She's walking behind the flag-draped caisson and the riderless horse with the boots reversed in the stirrups is in the procession. And the two of us are there to witness this. And then Senator Smathers has arranged for us to go with the press corps out to Arlington Cemetery. The grave is on a lowered position, and then there's a hill that goes all the way up to the Custis Lee Mansion. And as you look up the hill, over here is a grove of trees to the right. And that's where they had the press located. The two of us are standing there with the press, looking down on all of the proceedings. One of the things that shocked me was just before the playing of taps, I didn't expect the rifle volleys, 3 rifle volleys. I instantly looked at President Johnson. We were so conditioned with assassinations and then the killing by Jack Ruby of the assassin. I looked at Johnson, and Johnson was not hurt. And of course it was the rifle volleys, then followed by taps, then followed by the screams of 4 jet engines as Air Force One makes a low pass over Arlington Cemetery. You can see why it was such that I would never forget those things. This is how our lives have intertwined, and why it is a great privilege for me to be here today. Senator Smathers was known and called by his colleagues in the Senate the senator from Latin America. He had that as something that he particularly was concerned about, because well before the overthrow, he had met Castro, I think on an airplane flight, and talked to him and saw that this guy was pretty much a radical. And so when Castro came to power, Smathers was the one who could speak from personal experience what he thought was going to happen to Cuba. And as a result of that, he ended up being one of the advisors to Kennedy before the Bay of Pigs, which was only a few weeks, if not months, into Kennedy's term, which turned out to be a fiasco. He ended up, after Castro took over, to help set up Operation Pedro Pan, which was to get young people out of Cuba even though you couldn't get their parents, and they would have adoptive parents here in America. Senator Smathers was one of the leaders of that. And one of the beneficiaries of that program ended up being a United States senator and was elected while I was senator, and that's Senator Mel Martinez. Mel Martinez came over in Pedro Pan, had an adoptive family. He calls that adoptive family his second mother and father, and does so today. And there again, the fingerprints of George Smathers. So John F. Kennedy is credited with setting up the Alliance for Progress. It was a specific, intentional outreach to the countries in Latin America that had been ignored for so long because the interests of the United States had been elsewhere in the world. He tried to change that. And we've seen that that policy has been neglected quite a bit since. I didn't tell you that the relationship between Smathers and Kennedy was so good that Smathers ended up being a groomsman in the wedding with Jacqueline Kennedy. And I didn't mention that since he was friends with Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy, he had the ability to negotiate that friendship and still stay friends with the two of them, even though the two of them became extraordinary rivals. And so, as it inched closer and closer to the 1960 election, and Kennedy's barnstorming the country, starting to get pledges, and at the last minute, Johnson gets in, and they go to the convention in Los Angeles. Who's chairman of the convention, by the way? Another Floridian, Leroy Collins, Governor Collins. And Smathers, knowing that he can't take sides, works it out with the congressional delegation in Florida that he becomes the favorite son. Therefore, the delegation does not pledge to any of the active candidates. They are pledged to Senator Smathers on the first ballot at the National Convention. And of course, at this point, everybody thought it was up for grabs between Johnson and Kennedy. And then in the course of that, Kennedy gets the votes. Kennedy then has that famous meeting with Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson that didn't go too well. But President Kennedy, the then candidate Kennedy, knew he needed Johnson. George Smathers played a part of that. And as a result, we see, as we say, history tells us, okay, now Kennedy is president. And it's getting into 1963. And he goes to Texas because he knows he needs the electoral votes from Texas. And he's got Johnson. But Bobby Kennedy doesn't get along with Johnson. And there was the feeling that they were going to dump Johnson as vice president in the next election. Listen to this. The staff, the politicos, they need a Southerner. They were looking to a New South governor, Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina. And Kennedy is said to have remarked, I guess we'll have to do that, but I really want George. That tells you something about their friendship. So Senator Smathers then gave a 1988 gift of $2 million to renovate this library building. He gave a very generous testamentary gift for the whole library system. At the same time, he gave $10 million to the University of Miami. And I had the privilege later on of reminding him that he signed a picture of Bruce and me and him to Bill Nelson, my third son. So here we are, celebrating 100 years of a great, great history. A history that is now followed down with these two. And so, thank you all for having me. Any questions?
Hey, Senator Nelson, I'm Boyd Murphy. I'm the political papers archivist here. And one thing I wanted to say first is just last week I was showing a class some materials from the Smathers papers and some other collections on the the class was interested in Cold War related material, and one of the things that I showed them was a report that George Smathers wrote for John F. Kennedy in 1960, of course, when Kennedy was running for president, about Cuba, in which he's giving his views on what's going on there, what he thinks is going to happen. So the class was really fascinated about that. I just have a couple short little questions. I was listening to oral history that you gave back in 2008 for the Samuel Proctor Oral History Center, and it's 30 minutes. It's really fascinating, and you're talking about your early life in Florida up to your time when you were at UF. Did you do any other interviews after that about your future period? I was just wondering, and I have a couple questions based on that. But anyway, it was really interesting. And in that, the part about UF, one of the people that you mentioned that had a big impact on your life was a professor of political science named Ernest Bartley. And you talked about a lecture that he used to give that made a big impact on you. Take a drink, Mr. Socrates. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Professor Bartley and his impact on you. And also, of course, when you went to Yale, you gave a speech based on, I guess, Professor Bartley's lecture with the same title and won the speech award there in 1964 at Yale. So if you might comment on that.
One of the most dynamic professors when I was here was Ernest R. Bartley. And he would pack the students into a lecture hall. And this is the last lecture. And he has decided that his lecture is Have a Drink, Mr. Socrates. And he talks about how Socrates, the great raconteur of the day, resist all of the conformist, that he wants to keep dialogue open. By the way, it has some familiar rings in today's society. He wants to keep that dialogue going. And that's the theme of the speech. And it's just dramatic that he comes in and the jailer enters the cell with the hemlock, the cup of hemlock in his hand, and says, "Have a drink, Mr. Socrates." And then Socrates, the great iconoclast, takes the drink and conforms to the laws, even though it leads to his death. This speech so moved me, I kept a copy of it. He gave me a copy. By the way, on the final exam, he gave me an A- and then wrote, "I had to think hard in order to give you this grade." So by the skin of my chinny chin chin. Years later, I shared all of this with him later on. So it's getting around to junior year. Yale has only one speaking contest. It's named after some guy named Tin Ike. And the significance of it is not only the speaking contest, and I was considered a nobody. The guy that was thought to have it hands down, later a university president, by the way, years later, he gets up on his speech. I led off, and I nailed it. And of course, you couldn't look at any notes. It had to be memorized. And so he gets up, and he forgets what he's supposed to say. So the favorite doesn't make it, and somehow I squeaked in. The significance of that also is that the winner of the Tin Ike speaking contest back in those days was also the class orator at graduation. So I got to do that. Who won it the next year? John Kerry. Now Secretary of State, John Kerry. I remember practicing that speech with poor Bruce as my audience. Back in our little bedroom where we had bunk beds, remember that? We'd close the door and I'd practice the speech with you. Yes, sir.
This is a photocopy of you from the Yale newspaper of you receiving that award. So if you're welcome to have it if
Was
you'd like.
that in the archives?
There's a copy in your papers here. So one other little short question. It's just a kind of a humorous one. Also in that interview that you gave, you mentioned a gentleman named Dr. Pete Zeiss. Now, can you tell me what his significance is for the University of Florida?
Dr. Pete Zeiss is a retired skin doctor. He lives in Melbourne, Florida. We had gone to high school together. And the significance of him to the University of Florida is he was the first Albert the Alligator mascot on Florida Field. And this was in the day, they didn't have all of these extraordinary costumes that they have now. It was our freshman class project, and Albert was made out of baling wire and paper mache. And Peter Zeiss pranced around Florida Field, and that was the first Albert the Alligator on the field.
I think it's worth noting that your ties to the University of Florida are deeper and go back before 1962, that when in high school you traveled to PK Young as Key Club International president, flying on a jet around, or I think a Learjet, and you came to the University of Florida and we were in the same orientation group, and that orientation group helped him become president of the freshman class.
The jet is a myth. Yes, ma'am.
Maria Hove Edwards, Library Leadership Board. You have brought me to the brink of tears this afternoon because I know a lot of that history.
Turn it this way. Turn it this way. Yeah.
You have brought me to the brink of tears by retelling of so much of that story, because it means so much to me. But it is sad that as when we are young, we care nothing for history. And it is almost when we are older and on the brink of death that we're able to appreciate all the greatness of history. So for having done such a wonderful job today, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I'm headed to Washington. So, any other comments or questions? There we go.
I was struck by what you had to say, because I did teach a lot of what you had to say over the years. You know, I was a high school social studies teacher for 35 years. And anyway, what happened one time 2 years ago in the President's Suite was that I was there with one of our administrators, and he saw Cat Cammy coming down the way, and it started his eyes rolling. So I said to him, "I'll take care of it." So what I did is I managed within 30 seconds to a minute to have a kumbaya moment with Kat Kamek, even though our politics are totally opposite, but we bonded over having relatives in Minnesota. So I like your idea of trying to develop at least anything you can do to find a rapprochement between two diverse political thinkers. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I look at, from my experience, that the way to make a democracy work with the elected representatives, you have to work, if you'll visualize a football field, you have to work within the 40-yard lines. Either the center or center left or center right, you can usually find agreement and consensus. When the politics gets to the extreme, down toward the end zone, either way, it's so much more difficult. And when people stop listening to each other, it is so much more difficult. The other thing is that the elected representative has to take the initiative because the staff will not. So when Marco was elected and I was the senior senator, the staff always wanted to divide. But the two of us built a personal relationship, even to the point where on a couple, 3 occasions, I defended him in public. And you could see that whenever Marco and I get together today, even though he's gone off the Richter scale, that personal friendship survives it. And if it were up to the two of us, we could get the deal done. That's what we're missing today. You've got to recognize that the other fellow ought to have something of value and try to find it and see if he will be looking at you for something of your value and see if you can work it out. If you stop talking, it won't work. And we're seeing a result of that. Yes, Bruce.
Bill, could you just exemplify your efforts to cross the partisan aisle, just relate your efforts of getting to know Ted Cruz and what happened?
So do you all know who Senator Ted Cruz is? Okay. Ted had been a senator just a couple of months, and this is back in 2013, and he causes the shutdown of the government, which I think has now been surpassed, the number of days, this one from that one. But it's going into the 3rd week, and Ted is the one. That's when he gave his green eggs and ham speech, when he's holding the floor in a filibuster. And it's going into the 3rd week, and the Republicans are really getting blamed for the shutdown. And so we're in session on a Saturday, and the Republican senators have just had a caucus, and they have really given it to Ted because they're getting hurt. And so the meeting's over, and Ted is wandering around in the basement of the Senate. And Grace is down there with me that Saturday, and she sees Ted. She walks over to him, and she says, "Hi, Ted. I'm Grace Nelson. I'm Bill's wife." And she's friendly to him, and he perks up. Somebody's finally being nice to him. And they have a nice little conversation. She says, "Ted, why don't you go to dinner with us?" I am the only senator that has taken Ted Cruz to dinner. As a result of that, and then he and I being on the same committee, the Commerce Committee, which also has jurisdiction over NASA, he would be chairman of the subcommittee, or I would be chairman, whichever party had the majority. And I would just tolerate his extreme positions, for example, on climate change. But we always had a friendship. when I gave my farewell speech, two of the Republicans to speak at my farewell was Ted Cruz and John Thune, who is now the majority leader of the Senate. And so it's another example how you can reach across the aisle if you care about learning about them. I really would give him down the country on climate change.
Senator, hi. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. And we're here as friends of the Smathers family and longtime residents of Florida's Space Coast. And I wanted to share a really quick connection again that you've spoken about, particularly as it related to your speech contest. And I'm a new trustee for the Florida House up in Washington, D.C., and the first day we were there, who should I see but this wonderful Judy with a gator pin, and immediately have a connection. And I had attended University of Florida, my husband, and all three of our children. And I said our newest graduate graduated in 2020 in the middle of COVID. And I said, I want to share a story with you, Judy, and this relates to the library. There was a freshman contest, again, for a topic, I think it was called This I Believe. And the freshmen were required to participate. And Delana has cerebral palsy, had the highest score coming into UF of any of my three children. So proud of the university and what they're doing for students with disabilities to make education accessible. And she thrived here in her own way and made her indelible mark for the university. But I want you to know that using the latest technology, which is called eye gaze technology, Delana won for the freshman class in 2016. But the story was that she didn't get a gift certificate or a statue. Her speech is now in the library system and will stay here as a recorded document through the Smathers Library. And to us as a family, that was the greatest award ever, that it would live there, all 3.5 minutes of it. And so Delana had a question, and this is using her Tobii Dynavox.
I admire the story of both parties joining together on a weekly basis regardless of viewpoints and beliefs. I'm a firm believer that's how we learn from different perspectives as well as learn more about ourselves as human beings. With your service and leadership, advice would you give the next generation with a desire to create change but experience pushback and systemic barriers from opposing viewpoints?
And that's why she won.
By the way, that question is from one of Florida's pioneer families, the Parrish family from Titusville, Florida. Jay's father, J.J. Parrish, was one of the citrus pioneers of Florida. That was back before we had freezes that made all of the citrus go way south, and before the foreign bugs came in and started the invasive species killing all of our citrus industry. So my advice, it's really pretty simple. It's an age-old saying that everybody in this room will recognize. And I'll tell you where it's inscribed. It's inscribed on a very famous Norman Rockwell painting. And as you remember, Norman Rockwell, famous American painter that painted for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post starting, I think, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And he would always paint scenes of everyday American life. But there was one exception, and it was the cover in April of 1961, and it was all the peoples of the world in their native dress holding their children. And Norman Rockwell never put a title on a painting, but he did on this one. And it's applicable to your question. He wrote in gold letters across the backdrop of all the peoples of the world, "Do unto others as you would have them do to you." Put that in modern street language: treat others like you want to be treated. That would solve a lot of this. Ted Cruz and I treat each other that way. Marco and I treat each other that way. Mel Martinez and I treat each other that way. So I think deep down. Now, I'll close with this. I am writing a book now to see if 50 years of public service is worthwhile. And it's going to have a space theme that will be a thread that will run throughout it. Why were 4 years of me at NASA 4 of the happiest years in my professional life? Because NASA unifies. I had no trouble with R's and D's on the Hill with regard to NASA. It is such a can-do organization if they don't continue to rip it apart. And it brings people together. And that's what I think. If we can find those things that will unify instead of divide, then we'll come out of this temporary setback that we're in. Thank you all. I'm going to D.C.
Wow. Thanks so much, Senator. I could listen to a good storyteller all day. Mike Price and I were talking at the meeting about sitting in class with Professor Mike Gannon and being totally drawn in where I would just forget to take notes while I was sitting there, listening. And that's the kind of thing with the senator as well. Just a few real quick closeout things. So before we move to the next stage of our afternoon, I'd like to bring attention a pair of upcoming events, and the Senator mentioned one of them earlier. On Monday, January 12th, 2026, we'll welcome Senator Nelson back to campus, along with his crewmates from the Space Shuttle Columbia mission, for a 40th anniversary reunion and panel as part of the Nelson Initiative on Ethics and Leadership. On Tuesday, March 31st, 2026, we'll host the annual Mike Gannon Lecture featuring Pulitzer Prize award-winning author and historian Rick Atkinson. For you military history buffs, Army at Dawn, Long Gray Line. He's written a bunch of books. Company of Soldiers. Those are the 3 I had in my library at home, so I'm mentioning those specifically. So more details about each of these events will be available pretty soon. So we now invite you to enjoy our Taste of Smathers. So we're pleased to offer an open house tour of Smathers Library with bite-sized food selections and exhibits from our special collections curators. There are exhibits and food and beverages available on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floors of this building. Of course, you can tell the curators got involved in this. We do ask that you please enjoy food and beverages behind the stanchions as you view our valuable special collections. If you'd like to take a closer look at the material, feel free to use the tables provided to set your food and beverages down while you browse. There are also certain spaces that have signage to designate areas that prohibit food and beverages. Thank you again for attending today and for your continued support and investment in the University of Florida and in the Smathers Libraries. Everybody enjoy.